Joel C. Rosenberg is an American-Israeli communications strategist, author, and nonprofit executive. He has written 5 novels about terrorism and Bible prophecy, including the Gold Medallion Book Award winner, The Ezekiel Option. He also has written 2 nonfiction books, Epicenter and Inside the Revolution. Rosenberg was born in 1967 near Rochester, New York. He has stated that his father is of Jewish descent and his mother was born into a Methodist family of English descent. His parents were agnostic and became born-again Christians when he was a child in 1973. At the age of 17, he became a born-again Christian and now identifies as a Jewish believer in Jesus. The Last Jihad was both his first book and the first of a 5-part fictional series involving terrorism and how it may relate to Bible prophecy. The book was written 9 months before the 11th September attacks and was published in 2002. When published, The Last Jihad spent 11 weeks on the New York List bestseller list. Enemies and Allies and Jerusalem Assassin, and more novels that he wrote, in addition to his meetings with King Abdullah of Jordan, President of the UAE Mohammed bin Zayed, and Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia Mohammed bin Salman, all of which we will talk about in this episode. This program is brought to you by Prolific Solutions. Joining me today on the Pioneers TV show, Joel Rosenberg is editor-in-chief All Israel News and All Arab News, and he's a New York Times bestseller author. You're most welcome.
Great to be with you. Thank you, Maria.
I have a question. It's a little bit sensitive, but I hope you can answer it. Your last name is Rosenberg. You're an Israeli Christian. How that happened?
Yeah. Well, it's a good story. Well, of course, Jesus was Jewish and all his disciples were Jewish. And this is Israel's greatest, most famous Israeli in human history was Jesus of Nazareth, right? And not every Israeli believes that Jesus was Messiah. I do. And I became a citizen of Israel with my family almost 8 years ago. And we live here in Israel with 4 sons. 2 of my sons have served in the Israeli army. And well, look, there's great freedom of religion here in Israel. And I say that it's important because not every Israeli thinks it's a good thing that there are Jews who believe in Jesus, right? That for some, that's very controversial. It would be in the Muslim world as a Muslim who decides to leave Islam and become a follower of Jesus Christ as God, as Savior, as Lord. So it's controversial, but there's freedom here. So you have freedom to disagree. And I love that.
Wonderful. Let's start talking about your books. Let's talk about the first one, The Last Jihad. What was the main purpose of this book or the main idea?
Well, I began writing The Last Jihad in January of 2001. Okay. The first page, Maria, puts you inside the cockpit of a jet plane that's been hijacked by radical Islamist terrorists, and it's coming in on a kamikaze attack mission into an American city. Now, this is almost 9 months before the horrific events of 9/11. And in the novel, once that attack happens, the fictional American president declares war against radical Islamist cells, but also decides he has to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq because of his historic support for terrorists and his historic use of weapons of mass destruction. Now, to be clear, Maria, I wasn't predicting anything. I was writing a thriller, like a worst case scenario. I didn't think it was going to happen. I just thought, what if it did? What would that look like? And it became a huge bestseller as a result.
You have the vision that one of your books will become reality.
Well, again, it did somewhat become reality. Now, there were differences. I just want to be honest. My plane that was hijacked was a business jet, not a commercial flight. It was Denver, Colorado, not Washington or New York. Again, it's not like I was a prophet, but the concept was so close to what played out. And I was the first only novelist ever to write such a scenario, that's what took me from nobody had ever heard of me to being number one on Amazon, 11 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, 160 radio and TV interviews just in the first 2 months when that book released. And it set into motion a career in which, kings and presidents and vice presidents and secretaries of state and CIA chiefs have been reading my books, not just 5 million sold, but leaders. And it's opened a lot of interesting doors that I never expected, Maria.
Yeah. So what were the circumstances that led you to meet King Hussein of Jordan?
And well, it was King Abdullah, his son. Yeah.
King Abdullah, you're young. And,
yeah, that's right. I would have been honored to meet King Hussein, but I did not have. So what happened? Yeah. Well, what happened is I am a little crazy. Okay. I mean, people think that, meaning I wrote a novel series about what if ISIS in Syria decides to take over Jordan and they decide to try to assassinate King Abdullah II, blow up his palace, and take over the Hashemite kingdom. That's the premise of this particular series. It was called The Third Target, and then The First Hostage, and then Without Warning. It was a trilogy. Now, what happened is, it sounds like fiction, but it's true. King Abdullah read the second in the series. One of his advisors read it, just didn't know me, just happened to pick it up in Heathrow Airport on the flight on the way to Washington to meet the king. The king was going to meet President Obama. Anyway, President Obama canceled the meeting after the king was already there, decided to reschedule it. And suddenly King Abdullah had 2 days on his schedule with nothing to do in a Washington hotel room. And the advisor said, "You have to read this book." And the king said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're in it." He looked at it. He said, "What are you talking about? It's a novel. It's fiction, right?" "Yeah, but you're a character." And the king read it. And Maria, rather than banning me from the kingdom forever, which he, maybe he should have done, but he invited my wife and me to come and visit him for 5 days. This was in 2016. And the first meeting we had was at the palace that in my novel, terrorists had blown up. So that was the beginning of a friendship.
And what about the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman? You had a story that he's visiting Jerusalem. Did you meet him?
Yeah, so I wrote another novel called The Jerusalem Assassin, in which a Saudi crown prince wants to make peace with Israel, and a lot of bad things happen. That idea pulls out of the woodwork, Iran and Hezbollah and all kinds of other terrorists. Well, what happened is, even before I wrote it, but while I was researching it, I got invited to come to Saudi Arabia and bring a delegation of evangelical Christian leaders. I am an evangelical. To meet with His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman. And this was the summer of 2018 that I got the invitation. I said yes. And then a month before we arrived, Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. And it was a huge firestorm, and all the business investors and everybody was leaving Saudi Arabia and didn't want to have anything to do with MBS. And I understood that, except that I didn't know if he was guilty or not. And I didn't want to play judge and jury.
Yeah.
I'm an evangelical. One of my objectives for meeting him, it wasn't my idea to meet him, it was his idea. But one of my reasons for saying yes, there was two. One, I want to ask him why there are no churches in all of Saudi Arabia. Could you start building churches? Could I encourage you? And second, would you make peace with Israel? Now, to me, the issues of religious freedom and peace and security and Iran and all these other issues were very important. And I felt, well, one other thing, Maria, while we were preparing to go, but before Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, and it was a horrific, heinous murder. I mean, there's no excuse. It was insane. The question is whether MBS ordered it or knew, and I still think that the evidence does not prove it. Maybe it's true, but there's not proof. It's just conjecture.
Yeah.
The reason I want to say that is because Adel al-Jubeir is the foreign minister, or was the foreign minister at that time for Saudi Arabia. And I met with him in New York City and at the UN, and he said, Joel, do you realize that you're the first group of Christian leaders in the 300 years that the Saud family has controlled what we call Saudi Arabia today, that they've ever invited to come to the palace? And I said, no, I didn't realize that. That's pretty amazing, actually, especially for an Israeli Jewish evangelical to be invited to bring such a delegation. Never happened before. There's literally no other Israeli citizen who's ever been invited to meet publicly with the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. Even Netanyahu, there were no pictures.
And do you have any results, in fact, about any discussions you made with him?
Yes. In fact, a book that I just published in September of last year called Enemies and Allies. It's the only book that's ever been published in which MBS goes on the record to talk about all these issues. There have been books by Wall Street Journal reporters and the New York Times bureau chief in Lebanon, the whole biographies about MBS, but they never met him. They were never allowed to interview him. I'm the only one that's ever done it. The most significant thing he said was that the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, is the new Hitler. Now, that's the type of thing an Israeli leader says. I would not have expected the next king of Saudi Arabia to say it, and to say it on the record, and to say it to Christians sitting in the palace in Riyadh. That told me that I was dealing with a very different Muslim leader than any Saudi leader in the past, or almost any leader in the Muslim world for the last 1,400 years. I mean, he understands the threat of Iran just like Israel does. That is existential, not only to Israel, but to Saudi Arabia and the Arab world as well.
Okay, so how would you describe your relationship with these leaders, and how do you see the Israeli politics in general?
Well, so 22 years ago, a long time ago, I did work for a few months for then former Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. What's happened over the years, people say it like I was his closest advisor, best friend. It's not true. So yeah, I briefly worked for him. But the truth is that I actually I haven't seen him for 14 years as a private meeting, as opposed to covering him at a speech or something. But 2 weeks ago, he did invite me to bring a new delegation I was leading of evangelical leaders. We spent an hour with him, and it was fascinating. I will tell you, he is, the way they used to say about Richard Nixon, tanned, rested, and ready. He is looking for a comeback. He believes he will be prime minister again. It was very, very interesting meeting. But that delegation was my 7th delegation. We went to Bahrain, then the United Arab Emirates, and then back here to Israel.
Who did you meet in the UAE? With whom?
With Foreign Minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, the son of the founder. Now, the brother of the new president. And by the way, let me just extend my condolences to the nation and the leadership of the United Arab Emirates on the passing of Sheikh Khalifa. Of course, it doesn't mean a big transition, because the then Crown Prince, now the president, Mohammed bin Zayed, whom I've met with, we spent 2 hours with. I've gotten to know him and his team quite well. And I think he is an extraordinary leader it's MBZ who's responsible for the huge economic growth, the mission to Mars, the mission to the moon, the Abraham Accords, bringing the first ever evangelical delegation to the UAE that I led. And then a few months later, bringing Pope Francis, first time a Roman Catholic Pope had ever set foot and openly held a mass in the Arabian Peninsula. So The MBZ is an extraordinary leader. Now, a very behind the scenes, quiet strategist, and he's not doing interviews. He's not going on television. His meeting with us was off the record. Okay. But in that meeting in October 2018, I said, look, Christians are praying for peace. And we have not seen an Arab leader step forward and make peace with Israel since King Hussein in 1994. There's a whole generation that's gone by. Who is going to be the next Arab leader? And he leaned forward. I can say it now because it's now they put it on the record. He leaned forward and said, Joel, it's going to be me. We were shocked because this meeting was off the record. And now he opened up. Why is he ready? Remember, this is 2 years before the Abraham Accords. So he's trusting an Israeli, an evangelical, a group of evangelicals to not leak the biggest story in the Middle East in terms of peace in a quarter of a century. And we held that. We did not betray his confidence. And sure enough, he kept his word. And I'll give you a little scoop, Maria. I'm wondering, I think it's possible that MBZ is coming to Israel when President Biden comes in next month. I have a feeling that what Biden is cooking up is a regional summit. And we'll see if that happens.
Joel Rosenberg, thank you so much for being with us. I'm so glad to have you on the Pioneer Show.
Afwan, Maria, it's great to meet you finally, and I appreciated following each other on Twitter, and it's an honor to be on your program.
Hey, Maria Malouf here. Please click to like and subscribe to Maria Malouf TV YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.